The atmosphere that hung over the island of Oahu on the morning of December 7, 1941, was defined not by tension, but by a luxuriant, sedative, and ultimately fatal calm. It was a Sunday, a day sacrosanct in the United States Navy for holiday routine. The sun had risen at exactly 6:26 a.m., bathing the lush volcanic peaks of the Koolau Range in a soft, golden light that betrayed no hint of the violence approaching from the north. The trade winds were gentle, blowing from the northeast at roughly 10 knots, rustling the palm fronds along the beaches of Waikiki, where off-duty officers were already preparing for a leisurely day of surfing, golf at the Schofield Barracks course, or recovering from the revelries of Saturday night in Honolulu. Inside the massive natural fortress of Pearl Harbor, the pride of the Pacific Fleet lay at anchor, a collection of steel leviathans that represented the supreme projection of American industrial and military power in the 20th century. To the casual observer, or even the seasoned admiral observing from the hills of Makalapa, this alignment projected absolute invincibility. There were 8 battleships, the backbone of the Navy, lined up in the deep water berths along the southeast side of Ford Island, a formation known to the world as Battleship Row. The USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Nevada, USS Tennessee, USS Maryland, and the flagship USS Pennsylvania, which was in dry dock, represented millions of tons of hardened steel, bristling with 14-inch and 16-inch naval rifles capable of hurling armor-piercing shells over the horizon. But to a cold, tactical analyst, this formation was not a line of battle. It was a congested trap. The ships were moored in pairs, double-parked against concrete quays. This berthing arrangement was efficient for peacetime logistics, but fatal for wartime survival. The inboard ships, trapped between the quay and the outboard vessel, were imprisoned, unable to maneuver or escape without complex tugboat operations that would take hours. The USS Oklahoma lay outboard of the Maryland. The West Virginia shielded the Tennessee. This static geometry meant that the outboard ships were naked to torpedo attack, while the inboard ships were trapped in a steel cage, unable to bring their main batteries to bear or flee the harbor. The operational status of these behemoths was one of deep slumber. Their boilers were cold or set to low simmer, maintaining just enough steam to power the ship's lights and galleys. To bring a battleship from this cold iron state to full maneuvering power was a process of thermodynamic complexity that required up to 4 hours of heating water, building pressure, and spinning up massive turbines. In the event of a surprise attack, the fleet was physically incapable of movement. They were stationary targets, fixed to the map coordinates of their moorings as securely as the buildings on the shore. Furthermore, the defensive posture of the fleet was relaxed to the point of negligence. The watertight doors and hatches, hundreds of heavy steel barriers designed to compartmentalize the ship and prevent flooding, were largely open to allow airflow in the tropical humidity. This condition, known as condition X-ray, meant that if a hull were breached by a torpedo, the water would not be contained in a single compartment, but would rush freely through the passageways, dragging the ship down with terrifying speed. The anti-aircraft batteries, the ship's only defense against aerial assault, were largely unmanned. The ammunition lockers for the 50 caliber machine guns and the 5-inch anti-aircraft guns were padlocked for safety, the keys held by duty officers who were often asleep in their bunks or ashore. The ready service boxes at the gun tubs were empty. The entire fleet was configured for peace, not war. The strategic assumption that governed this calm was absolute and unchallenged. Pearl Harbor was too far from Japan, too heavily fortified, and too vigilant to be attacked by surprise. The Japanese fleet was assumed to be thousands of miles to the west, likely posturing towards Malaya or the Dutch East Indies to secure oil reserves. The intelligence reports that reached Admiral Kimmel spoke of sabotage, of local unrest, not of a carrier strike force capable of crossing the treacherous North Pacific undetected. This complacency was not merely a mood. It was a structural blindness that permeated every level of command. The war warning, sent from Washington on November 27th, had been interpreted locally as a warning against sabotage. As a result, the Army Air Forces, commanded by General Walter Short, had ordered their aircraft at Wheeler and Hickam Fields to be parked in tight, neat rows in the center of the tarmac. This alignment made them easier to guard against saboteurs on the ground, but it turned them into perfect, clustered targets for bombers from the air. The P-40 Warhawks and B-17 Flying Fortresses were wingtip to wingtip, fueling trucks parked alongside them, creating a dense, explosive, target-rich environment. The silence of that Sunday morning was not empty. It was heavy with the accumulated weight of 1,000 overlooked warnings, bureaucratic inertia, and 1,000,000 miles of ocean that everyone assumed was a defensive wall, but which the enemy had treated as a concealed highway. The island was a slumbering giant, guarded by the most advanced technology of the age: radar, listening posts, and patrols, yet protected by absolutely nothing, because the mind of the command structure refused to accept the possibility of the threat. High above this scene of maritime tranquility, on the northernmost tip of the island, at a remote, windswept station called Opana Point, the war was about to make its first silent contact. Here, at 532 feet above sea level, surrounded by scrub brush and the roar of the Pacific surf crashing against the cliffs below, sat two young privates of the Army Signal Corps, Joseph Lockard and George Elliott. They were nearing the end of a graveyard shift that had been uneventful to the point of crushing boredom. They were the eyes of the island, the operators of a secret cutting-edge device known as the SCR-270 radar. To them, the geopolitical storm brewing in the Pacific was a distant theoretical concept, a series of headlines from Europe. They did not know that they were sitting at the precise focal point of history. In the next hour, the invisible radio waves pulsating from their antenna would capture the first ghostly signature of the greatest naval disaster in American history. The void of that Sunday morning was about to be filled with a signal that should have saved the fleet, but instead became the epitaph of a failed warning system. The tragedy of Pearl Harbor did not begin with the first bomb dropping on a hangar. It began in the silent, electronic ether, with a message that was seen, reported, and tragically, catastrophically dismissed. To comprehend the magnitude of the failure at Pearl Harbor, one must first perform a forensic examination of the technology that almost prevented it. The Signal Corps Radio Model 270, SCR-270. In 1941, radar, radio detection and ranging, was not the polished, digitized certainty of modern warfare. It was a chaotic, analog science of pulses and echoes, a dark art barely understood even by the senior officers commanding it. The SCR-270 deployed at Opana Point was a mobile, long-range air search radar, a marvel of pre-digital engineering that pushed the boundaries of 1940s physics, yet remained fatally limited by the very laws it exploited. The physical apparatus was imposing. It consisted of two heavy trucks, one carrying the generator and operating console, the other towing the massive, bed-spring-like antenna array. This antenna, a complex lattice of dipoles, had to be manually or mechanically rotated to sweep the horizon. It functioned by blasting high-power radio pulses at a frequency of 106 megahertz into the sky. These pulses traveled at the speed of light, searching the void. When this electromagnetic energy struck a metal object, like the aluminum skin of a Japanese bomber, a microscopic fraction of that energy was reflected back to the antenna. The radar measured the time delay between the pulse transmission and the return echo to calculate range. However, the data presentation was primitive. The operator did not see a map with icons. He peered into a small, glowing cathode ray tube known as the A-scope. The screen displayed a horizontal green line of static grass, electronic noise. A target appeared not as a plane, but as a vertical spike or pip disrupting the line. Interpreting this data required intense skill, intuition, and a tactile feel for the machine. The operator had to distinguish between the solid, rhythmic spike of an aircraft formation and the flickering ghosts of atmospheric interference, bird flocks, or the sea return generated by high waves crashing against the cliffs. It was less like watching a screen and more like reading a heartbeat. The SCR-270 had a theoretical range of 150 miles, providing a critical 30 to 40-minute warning window. But this electronic eye suffered from two catastrophic forms of blindness. First, it was a 2D radar. It could tell the operator the distance, range, and the direction, azimuth, of a target, but it was physically incapable of determining altitude. The radar beam was a broad, fan-shaped lobe. A plane flying at 500 feet skimming the waves produced the exact same pip on the scope as a plane flying at 20,000 feet. This meant the operator could say, "Something is coming," but he could not say, "It is a high-altitude bomber formation." Second, and most critically, the system lacked IFF, identification friend or foe, technology. The radar pulse bounced off American aluminum just as well as Japanese aluminum. There was no electronic transponder to query the target. Every blip was anonymous. Every signal was a question mark. To identify a target, the radar data had to be cross-referenced with handwritten flight plans back at the information center. A slow, bureaucratic process prone to error. The physics of the radar also included a dangerous dead zone caused by the geography of Oahu itself. The radar at Opana was situated high up, but the mountains behind it created permanent echoes, ground clutter, on the screen. Furthermore, as aircraft got closer to the station, within 20 miles, the return signal became so powerful and chaotic that it merged with the ground clutter, effectively blinding the radar to targets directly overhead or about to attack. The SCR-270 was designed to be a sentry on the horizon. It was useless for close-in battle management. On that fateful morning, the machine worked perfectly within its physical limits. It saw what it was built to see. But it was a sensor without a brain, generating critical data that the human command structure was utterly unprepared to process. The human element of the tragedy centers on the interaction between Private Joseph Lockard and Private George Elliott inside the cramped, humming radar truck at Opana Point. Lockard was the specialist, a man who had mastered the fickle art of tuning the vacuum tubes and reading the jittery scope. Elliott was the novice, the truck driver who was learning the basics of the system. Their orders were strictly defined by the peacetime schedule. The radar was to operate from 4 a.m. to 7 a.m., covering the dawn patrol window. At 7 a.m. sharp, the exercise was over. The war game was finished. They were to shut down the high-voltage generator, stow the antenna, and head to breakfast. Fate, however, intervened in the form of a mundane logistical delay. The truck that was supposed to take them back to the barracks was late. It was this trivial inconvenience, a late breakfast truck, that kept the radar set running past its scheduled shutdown time, creating the narrow window for history to occur. At 7 a.m., the official watch ended. But Elliott, eager to practice, asked Lockard if they could keep the set running while they waited. Lockard agreed. At 7:02 a.m., the screen changed. It did not flicker. It erupted. A massive spike appeared on the A-scope, so large and so solid that it seemed to vibrate on the phosphor screen. It was not the typical, wavering blip of a single patrol plane or a flock of birds. It was a solid, pulsating column of light that signified a target of immense, unprecedented physical size. Elliott, staring at the anomaly, assumed the machine was broken. He thought the equipment had malfunctioned or that he was seeing a massive ground return echo caused by a cloud layer. He called Lockard over. Lockard, initially skeptical and tired, slid into the operator's seat. He recalibrated the equipment, checking the gain and tuning the receiver to filter out noise. The blip remained. It was huge. In his entire experience at Opana Point, he had never seen a signal of this magnitude. The oscilloscope indicated a formation of aircraft larger than anything the American forces on Hawaii could muster, larger than anything he had ever seen in a drill. The physics of the return signal suggested not 5 or 10 planes, but 50 or more. Lockard manipulated the controls to determine the coordinates. The target was located 132 miles to the north-northeast, closing fast. The azimuth was 3 degrees east of north. The two privates were staring at the electronic ghost of Commander Fuchida's first wave, 183 Japanese bombers, dive bombers, and Zero fighters. They were the only 2 Americans on the planet who knew the attack was coming. But they were privates, the lowest rank in the military hierarchy. They possessed the ultimate intelligence data, but they lacked the authority to interpret it as a threat. They were technicians of a machine that was essentially a glorified alarm clock with the ringer turned off. A debate ensued in the truck. Was it a glitch? Was it a massive formation of Navy planes from a carrier they didn't know about? Lockard tracked the Echo again. It was moving at 180 miles per hour, straight for Oahu. The consistency of the speed and the directness of the path ruled out drifting clouds or birds. This was a coordinated flight. The decision to make the call was not a tactical one driven by panic. It was a bureaucratic one driven by procedure. They called because the truck was late and the blip was too big to ignore. At 7:06 a.m., Private Elliott picked up the field telephone, initiating the conversation that would seal the fate of the Pacific Fleet. He was about to try and transmit a digital reality into an analog chain of command that was deaf to the warning. At 7:06 a.m., Private George Elliott picked up the field telephone at Opana Point. The connection crackled with static as it routed through the island's switchboard network. He was calling the information center at Fort Shafter, the nerve center of the Hawaiian air defense system. In theory, this center was a bustling hub of activity, a war room staffed by senior liaison officers from the Navy, the Army Air Forces, and the anti-aircraft artillery, all ready to interpret radar data, verify flight plans, and scramble interceptors within minutes. In reality, on this Sunday morning, it was a tomb. The senior officers had departed for breakfast at 7 a.m., leaving the vast operations floor in the hands of a single, inexperienced junior officer, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler. Tyler was a pursuit pilot, not a radar specialist. He had arrived for his second day of orientation duty and had essentially been left to mind the store. He had no training in reading the raw oscilloscope data. He had no authority to activate the air raid sirens. He had no direct line to Admiral Kimmel. He stood alone overlooking the massive map table, where wooden blocks representing aircraft were usually pushed by plotters. Now, the table was empty, the plotters having gone to the mess hall. Tyler was the only link between the electronic eyes on the mountain and the sleeping fleet in the harbor. When Elliott's call came through, it was first answered by the switchboard operator, Private Joseph McDonald. McDonald, hearing the panic in Elliott's voice, was alarmed by the report of a large number of planes coming from the north. McDonald recognized the potential severity, but he was an enlisted man with zero command authority. He looked for an officer. He eventually put Elliott through to Lieutenant Tyler. The conversation that followed is perhaps the most scrutinized and tragic dialogue in American military history. Elliott, constrained by strict security protocols that forbade mentioning specific numbers of aircraft over an open phone line to prevent spies from learning the radar's capabilities, could not scream, "There are 50 planes." Instead, he simply stated that the radar had picked up a huge formation coming from the north. "The biggest sighting we have ever seen." Lieutenant Tyler listened. He was not negligent. He was logical. But his logic was based on a peacetime context. His mind searched for a rational explanation for a large formation of planes approaching Oahu on a Sunday morning. He landed on the only variable he knew. He recalled hearing the local radio station, KGMB, playing Hawaiian music all night long, a practice used to provide a homing beacon for incoming trans-Pacific flights. He also remembered a casual mention in a briefing that a flight of B-17 flying fortresses was due to arrive from the mainland that morning. The pieces fit perfectly in his mind. The B-17s were coming from the northeast. The radar blip was from the north. The discrepancy in direction was easily explained by navigational drift or the crudeness of the radar azimuth. It was close enough. In Tyler's mind, the massive blip was simply the friendly bomber squadron arriving for a stopover. The possibility of a Japanese carrier strike force was so strategically remote, so logistically impossible, that it didn't even register as a threat variable. It was a black swan event that his training had not prepared him to recognize. Tyler spoke the words that would define the tragedy. Well, don't worry about it. It was not an order of malice. It was an order of assumption. He assumed the system was tracking friends. He assumed the radar operators were excitable privates seeing a friendly ferry flight. Lockhart and Elliott, trained to obey officers without question, accepted the dismissal. They did not scramble fighters. They did not sound the air raid sirens. They hung up the phone. They continued to watch the blip close the distance, 100 miles, 70 miles, 50 miles. The electronic warning had been successfully delivered and successfully neutralized by the cognitive bias of a single man. The system had worked technically, but failed psychologically. The warning had traveled 30 miles of telephone wire only to die on the desk of a lieutenant who thought he was looking at friends. The tragedy of Lieutenant Tyler's assumption is compounded by the cruel, almost literary irony that he was technically correct. At that precise moment, a flight of 12 B-17D flying fortresses from the 38th and 88th Reconnaissance Squadrons was indeed approaching Oahu. They had flown over 14 hours from Hamilton Field, California, a pioneering long-distance navigation flight intended to reinforce the Philippines. However, the condition of these aircraft made them utterly incapable of defense, let alone repelling an invasion. They were the perfect, unwitting decoys. To maximize range for the arduous ferry flight, the B-17s, the flying fortresses, had been stripped of their fortress capabilities. They carried no armor plate to save weight. Crucially, they carried no ammunition. Their heavy .50 caliber machine guns were packed in Cosmoline grease for transit to prevent salt corrosion. The ammunition belts were stowed in cargo holds. The crews were exhausted, flying on fumes, their eyes burning from 14 hours of staring at the Pacific horizon. They were expecting a peaceful landing, a hot breakfast at Hickam Field, and a shower. As the B-17s broke through the cloud layer over Oahu at roughly 8 a.m., they found the sky filled not with friendly escorts, but with the swarming Zeros and Vals of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The American pilots, initially confused, thought the bursts of flak and the diving planes were part of a realistic Sunday morning drill. They admired the realism of the U.S. Navy's practice. Major Truman Landon, commanding the flight, famously shouted over the interphone when a fighter passed his wing, "Damn it, those are real bullets!" The realization of horror came too late. The Japanese Zeros, recognizing the vulnerable American bombers, engaged them with ferocity. The B-17s, huge and defenseless, scattered like a flock of birds attacked by hawks. They dove for any available runway. Hickam, Bellows, even the Kahuku golf course. They were forced to land amidst strafing runs and exploding hangars. Some were destroyed on the runway before they could taxi to safety. Others managed to belly land, their crews scrambling into the chaos of the burning airfields. One B-17 landed with its flares ignited by enemy fire, splitting in two. The B-17s had arrived just in time to become the first aerial victims of the attack they had inadvertently masked. Tyler's friendly force had indeed arrived, but it was impotent, providing cover for the enemy armada behind it. Back at Opana Point, Lockhart and Elliott continued to track the incoming signal until 7:39 a.m. At that point, the target was within 20 miles of the coast. Here, the physics of the radar failed them once again. The massive return signal from the aircraft merged with the permanent ground clutter caused by the mountains of Oahu. As the Japanese planes descended to attack altitude, hugging the valleys to mask their approach, they dropped below the radar's line of sight. The blip disappeared into the dead zone caused by the radar's inability to distinguish low-flying objects from the island's terrain. The electronic eye went blind. Lockhart and Elliott, believing their duty was done and their warning dismissed by a superior officer, turned off the high-voltage generator. The screen faded to black. They locked the truck and began the drive down the winding mountain road for breakfast, completely unaware that the planes they had tracked were now deploying for attack runs just a few miles away. 16 minutes of silence followed. During this time, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the Japanese air armada, deployed his forces with surgical precision. The high-level bombers climbed to 12,000 feet. The torpedo bombers dropped to wave-top height to mask their approach against the dark water of the harbor. They used the cloud cover over the Kulau Range to hide their final approach, slipping through the valleys like ghosts. At 7:53 a.m., Fuchida signaled, "Tora! Tora! Tora!" the code indicating that complete surprise had been achieved. At 7:55 a.m., the first bomb struck the seaplane ramp on Ford Island. The sound of the explosion rolled across the island, reaching the ears of Admiral Kimmel, who was preparing for a golf game. The warning provided by the radar, a 50-minute window that could have allowed the fleet to set Condition Z, man the anti-aircraft guns, get steam up in the boilers, and close watertight doors, had evaporated. The battleships were sitting ducks, their crews asleep or eating, their guns unmanned. The short message from Opana Point had been the difference between a battle and a massacre. The technological miracle of radar had provided the data to save the fleet, but the human chain of command had thrown it away, leaving the Pacific Fleet to face the wrath of the rising sun entirely unprepared. At 7:55 a.m., the first bomb struck the seaplane ramp at the southern tip of Ford Island. The sound, a dull percussive thud, followed by the tearing shriek of secondary explosions, rolled across the island, traversing the 7 miles to the Fort Shafter Information Center. Inside the windowless plotting room, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler sat in a silence that was about to be shattered forever. The transition from peace to total war was not gradual. It was instantaneous, violent, and confusing. The phone lines, previously dead or humming with static, suddenly lit up with a frantic, incoherent cacophony. The first reports were fragmented and disbelieved. A call from Hickam Field reported, "We are being bombed." But the voice was drowned out by the background roar of engines. Another line from Wheeler Field screamed that Japanese markings had been spotted on diving aircraft. Tyler, the man who had dismissed the warning 50 minutes earlier, was now the center of a collapsing command structure. He stood frozen over the map table. The wooden blocks, which had been removed when Lockhart and Elliott signed off, were now being thrown back onto the table by terrified plotters rushing back from breakfast. But the data was now useless. The radar stations were reporting tracks everywhere. Hostiles over Diamond Head, hostiles over Barber's Point, hostiles over the harbor. The tragedy of the information center in those first minutes was the paralysis of verification. The system was designed to track distinct, long-range threats in a sterile environment. It was not designed for a saturation attack. Tyler realized with a sickening, physical dread that the B-17s he had visualized in his mind were, in fact, the vanguard of an invasion force. The cognitive dissonance crashed down upon him. The friendly flight plan he had relied upon was now the cover story for the enemy. The room, designed to bring order to the sky, became a box of helpless observation. Officers shouted for authentication codes that did not exist. They tried to call the airfields to scramble fighters, only to find the lines dead or the airfields already burning. The radar network, which had provided a perfect 50-minute window of clarity, was now generating a blizzard of data that the human brain could not process in real time. The information center had become a historian of disaster, recording the destruction it had failed to prevent. In the chaotic, smoke-filled hours following the departure of the second Japanese wave, the SCR-270 radar system experienced a strange, terrifying resurrection. As the fires burned on the twisted hulks of the USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma, the radar operators at Opana Point and other stations across Oahu remained at their posts, staring into their oscilloscopes with a new, desperate hypervigilance. The blindness of the attack phase was replaced by a state of electronic paranoia. The screens began to show phantom echoes. Throughout the afternoon and evening of December 7th, the radar continued to register blips, formations approaching from the north, the south, the west. Each blip triggered a new wave of panic at headquarters. Was the Japanese fleet returning for a third strike? Was an invasion landing force approaching the beaches? These ghosts were the result of a frantic, uncoordinated system pushing itself beyond its physics. Some echoes were likely U.S. Navy search planes, launched in a desperate, uncoordinated attempt to find the Japanese carriers. Others were atmospheric anomalies, sea return from the high waves, or even the radar beams interfering with each other. But in the fevered atmosphere of the information center, every pip was treated as an incoming raid. Air raid sirens wailed repeatedly across the shattered island, sending exhausted crews scrambling back to their guns, weeping with frustration. The tragedy of the Phantom Fleet culminated in a horrific incident on the night of December 7th. In the darkness, a flight of 6 U.S. Navy F-4F Wildcat fighters from the carrier USS Enterprise attempted to land at Ford Island to refuel. The radar operators picked them up. The jittery anti-aircraft gunners, who had been staring at empty radar screens and listening to rumors of a third wave all day, saw the approaching lights. The communication breakdown that had doomed the morning repeated itself. There was no IF, identification friend or foe, coordination. The gunners, believing they were under attack by a night raid, opened fire with everything they had. The sky over Pearl Harbor lit up with American tracers. 4 of the 6 American fighters were shot down by their own comrades. The pilots, who had survived the day's desperate search for the enemy, were killed by friendly fire driven by panic and a lack of electronic identification. This incident was the grim coda to the day's failures. It proved that a radar system without a robust, integrated command and control network is not a defensive asset. It is a liability. The inability to distinguish friend from foe, which had led Kermit Tyler to dismiss the Japanese as B-17s in the morning, had now led American gunners to destroy their own saviors in the dark. In the weeks and months following the attack, the United States launched a series of massive investigations, culminating in the Roberts Commission and later congressional hearings. The focus inevitably narrowed on the radar warning. Private Joseph Lockard and Private George Elliott were called to testify. They recounted the events of 7:02 a.m. with simple, devastating clarity. The massive blip, the call, the dismissal. Their testimony provided the smoking gun of the investigation, proof that the technology had worked, but the system had failed. Lockard and Elliott were initially hailed as heroes for their vigilance, receiving medals and promotions, but they carried the heavy burden of the what if for the rest of their lives. They had seen the enemy, but they were powerless to stop him. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler faced a brutal interrogation of his actions. Why did he assume they were B-17s? Why didn't he ask for more details? Tyler maintained that he followed protocol. He had been told about the B-17 flight. He had been told the radar was just for training at that hour. He had no authority to scramble fighters without confirmation. The investigation ultimately cleared him of dereliction of duty, recognizing that he was a victim of a systemic failure. He was a junior officer placed in a position of immense responsibility without the training or the authority to act. The true villain was not Tyler, but the complacency of the command structure, Admirals Kimmel and General Short, who had failed to integrate the radar into a 24-hour, war-ready defense network. They had treated the radar as an experimental toy, not a vital sensor. The inquiry revealed that the failure was not one of eyes, but of brains. The information was there, but the imagination to understand it was missing. The disaster at Pearl Harbor was the catalyst for a total revolution in air defense that defines military strategy to this day. The U.S. military realized that radar alone is useless. It must be part of an integrated air defense system, IADS. This meant creating filter centers where radar data from multiple stations could be cross-referenced, verified, and displayed on a master plot board in real time. It meant installing IFF transponders in every Allied aircraft, so a blip could electronically identify itself as friend, eliminating the ambiguity that doomed the morning of December 7th. It meant establishing direct, hot-line communications between the radar plotters and the fighter squadrons, removing the layers of bureaucracy that had delayed Elliott's call. The system that failed at Pearl Harbor became the negative blueprint for the system that won the Battle of Britain and later defended the U.S. fleets in the Pacific. The modern concept of the CIC, Combat Information Center, on a warship, a dark room glowing with screens and plotted tracks, was born from the chaotic failure of the Fort Shafter Information Center. We learned that information must move faster than the enemy. Final verdict. The catastrophe was not a failure of detection, but a failure of imagination. The command structure could not imagine that the Japanese would be bold enough to attack. They could not imagine that a massive radar blip could be anything other than a glitch or a friendly flight. This cognitive bias blinded them to the evidence on the screen. The legacy of Private Lockard's blip is the modern doctrine of detect, identify, engage. It taught the military that in the age of air power, ambiguity is fatal. The message, large number of planes, was too short. It should have been attack imminent. The difference between those two phrases cost 2,403 American lives and launched a global war. The ghost of the Opana radar station stands as a permanent monument to the price of complacency and the enduring truth that technology can see the future, but only people can act on it.